Good evening, everyone. This is Ana Morena. I'm going to be your host for tonight. Thank you very much for being here with us. We have the pleasure of having our dear friend, Daniel Assisi, tonight. And he will be sharing his knowledge with all of us.
Now, let's try this. And can you see it?
Yes. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. Well, so thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here today and taking the time out of your busy days to spend some time with us, just thinking about what is it that that we could do to learn a little bit more about this very difficult topic, which I take to be suicide. And I'm going to do another check here and make sure that we're not going crazy. Can you still see my screen, or is it going back in and out?
No, it's going back in and out.
Yeah, hold on a quick second here. Apologies. Let's try this again. How about now?
Yeah.
Okay. So as I was saying, this is a topic that I find really important to our day-to-day lives nowadays, because in one way or another, we have all probably been exposed to somebody who either went through a suicide attempt or maybe have committed suicide, or in fact has at least tried or asked for help. So it's a topic that kind of touches all of us, directly or indirectly. And it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one if we are to use our traditional lens of the material lives that we live in. So when we look at suicide from everything that we see every day in our lives, we can see that it's a difficult topic to broach, because it's about pain and it's about suffering. And I think we can all agree that we see pain and suffering everywhere, and that sometimes problems do seem quite big and quite insurmountable. So from that perspective, we can understand why somebody would think about suicide. On the other hand, what we hope to bring here today is the idea that when we are able to zoom out and look at life from a little bit of a different spiritual perspective, or actually include a spiritual perspective in the mix, then the idea of suicide changes ever so slightly. It becomes a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And what we hope to do today is talk a little bit about how an overall spiritual perspective to life can help us potentially better navigate the idea of suicide if we have those thoughts ourselves, or if we know anybody who may have them as well. So what we hope to do is talk about suicide from a spiritual perspective, and hopefully our goal is to provide a different perspective and a different lens through which we can see the whole piece. And I hope that's helpful, and I'd love your questions at the end. And if that's okay with you, I also want to take a slightly different approach to this, so bear with me. I hope it makes sense for you at the end. If not, you're all most welcome to ask questions. But I wanted to start briefly by sharing with you this incredible number, which is 42,773. That is the number of suicides a year in the United States. That is an incredible, incredible high number. And if you get a little bit closer to that number and really start looking at that, you find out that that equates to 5 suicides an hour. So to put this into perspective, by the time that we are done talking here today and having our conversations and asking questions and thinking about the topic, 5 people somewhere in the country would have taken their lives. So clear, this is an epidemic in very large proportions. In fact, it is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, which should tell you something. You know, it's really, really amazing how many suicides we have. and we hope to break that stigma a little bit. And I also have a little bit more bad news. We wish that the trend was going the other way, but in fact, when we look at the number of suicides per year, we see that they are also increasing. If we look at this trend from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, this graph here shows you the number of suicides per 100,000 people in the United States. And so you see that the line has been steadily growing, which means that per 100,000 people, there are more people committing suicide. And you may ask yourself, then, why are you telling us about this, per 100,000 people? It's because this is a good way for us to figure it out if suicide is going up or down, independent of how much the population grows, right? So if you think about it, in 2006, there were less people in the United States than in 2014. So it's understandable that we would have more suicides today because more people have been born, we have more people who have come in. So we wanted to look at it proportionally to say if proportionally, if we can isolate things, is the trend getting better or is it getting worse? And as you can see here a little bit, it is getting a little bit worse. We're climbing up on the number of suicides per 100,000 individuals in the country, which, if you think about it, it's really surprising in a lot of ways, especially when we consider that we have all these comforts for life. Modern life has given us a great many, comforts and technology that can make our life easier. We can visit the world in an airplane. We can talk to people over the internet rather easily. But still, that hasn't solved the void, that pain that we have in our hearts. And that is something for us to pay attention to. At the same time, I also want to stop really quickly and, after showing you those numbers, to hopefully impress on you the importance of the topic and how it is important for us to think about how widespread this is. I also wanted to share with you the reasons why people suicide. And in fact, I also want to make a parenthesis to say that it's very important for us to also change our language around suicide, because normally we even say commit suicide. And even the word commit really has more of a criminal sense to it, right? We just say people commit a crime. They never commit a good act, right? And so even psychologically, we invite everybody to consider changing the idea of committing suicide, because it is not a crime from a physical perspective. It is really just misinformation. So when we think about suicide, there are the 6 main reasons that are generally classified as the ones why people do it. The first one, you probably guessed. People are highly depressed. They are really unhappy about life. The second one is a psychotic nature. They either schizophrenic or have some other mental illness that, leads them to hear voices or believe that they really should do this, which is something we can talk a little bit about later on in our talk too, because I think that we are uniquely equipped to talk about that specific cause. And the third reason here is impulse. And what does that mean, impulse? It's generally attached to something else, like somebody is drunk a little bit more than usual, or perhaps is using drugs, and in that moment of weakness, of impulse, it decides all of a sudden to commit suicide. And so we have a lot of those cases too. And the fourth reason that people try to attempt suicide is because they're crying out for help. They really don't want to suicide, but call somebody's attention. But sometimes it goes wrong too. So that's also important for us to understand that attempts are really interesting. As I might have mentioned before, there are about 5 attempts for every actual suicide. So if somebody is likely to suicide and end their life, they're also very likely to try multiple times beforehand until they actually do it. So it gives us a little bit of a runway and an alarm system, if you will, for us to understand that the person does need help and maybe that we can help. So that's something to pay attention to. The 5th reason is one that I think we're all probably aware of, and we probably heard about it in the news. It's a philosophical desire to end their lives. It's generally because they have had the time to think about it. Maybe they have a terminal illness and they feel like their quality of life will be reduced over time, so they decide to end their life, on their own terms, right? As opposed to wait for the final decay of the body, if you will. And the sixth reason is actually a mistake. Surprisingly enough, this is actually a cause for suicide. People who accidentally end up killing themselves, either because they were cleaning a gun and they ended up doing that, or because they were trying to call for attention but didn't realize that, they were taking a dosage of drugs, for instance, that was more than necessary to kill them. So an example for that in some cases that we see some teenage girls is girls are more likely to commit suicide, for instance, with pills. And so they might take a bottle of Tylenol, so to will, and then but know that their parents are going to arrive home in 30 minutes, so they feel that in 30 minutes the parents will find them and they'll be able to help them and take them to the doctor and so forth. It turns out that they do, but when they get into the doctor, the amount of Tylenol was so big that it actually damaged their liver, and so it becomes impossible for them to be actually saved, and they end up dying even though they didn't mean to. So there are very different reasons. There are very different and difficult cases that speak to us, whether it's depression, whether it's a psychotic nature, if it's an impulse decision, or if it's somebody who's just trying to cry out for help, or the philosophical desire to actually end their lives because of a terminal illness or a simple mistake. The fact is, with that high ratio of 5 to 1, of 5 attempts to 1 actual suicide, it gives us fodder for thought. And if we haven't gone through this, we have a chance to seek out help, or at least offer help. And we also want to make sure that folks always know that there are many suicide hotline crises that are available 24/7. So you don't have to take it on your own or upon yourself to talk to somebody out of committing suicide. You can get professional help free of charge. You just Google it, and you'll find tons of it, of folks who have been trained to talk to people who have this situation, and has this great desire to end their lives. So these 6 buckets are interesting because it helps us understand where people are coming from and why they get there. But if I were to say anything about suicide, I would want to make one point, which is the way I look at it. Suicide is not about dying. Suicide is about ending pain, ending suffering. These people who are thinking about suicide, and we need to kind of step into it a little bit to kind of try to understand what's at stake here. They feel that there's such a big problem, that there is such an immense challenge in their lives, and that their difficulties and their problems are so insurmountable and large that they cannot see a way out of it. They are either in pain physically or emotionally or psychologically, and all they want is for it to stop. And they cannot find a way for that pain to stop. So they think that by taking their own lives, it will go away. And I think that's very important because it's not about death itself. It's about ending pain or not being in pain anymore. And that should be something that resonates with us because even though most of us may not have led ourselves or been in that position where we think that we need to take our lives because of suffering, we all know that pain is not a pleasant thing. And we all want it to end, whether we've broken an arm before or we burned our hand and that persistent pain was there. We all got annoyed by that and wanted it to end. Now, imagine if the pain was substantially higher and longer and deeper. It would cause somebody to be really desperate. And when we go into that frame of mind, as you can understand, it is really difficult to come out. So the desire or the urge to commit suicide is driven by these factors, and it's generally a great indicament of incredible pain. So what we really want to talk about and address to a certain extent is pain, it's suffering. And I want to invite us to shift our minds to the idea of suffering in general, which might make it even more accessible to all of us, even those of us who have not had contact with people who have attempted suicide or don't know what it looks like in the real life, to consider that learning and understanding a little bit more about suffering could benefit all of us, regardless of the situation. So I'm going to ask for your indulgence a little bit to talk about suffering and talking about pain, to see if we can understand the causes of pain and suffering, and therefore afterwards we can try to find out how do we address that so we can no longer go down this very dangerous slippery slope that could lead us or somebody that we love that know to suicide. So if we are to talk about pain and try to discover its causes, its nature, its roots, I want to ask for your patience a little bit and actually tell you a little story. I want to tell you a little story about this incredible prince called Siddhartha Gautama, which we all know to be recognized nowadays as the Buddha. But what's really interesting, according to the Buddhist tradition, is that Siddhartha Gautama was very neat. I promise I'm going to go somewhere here, by the way. He was a prince, and obviously being a prince, he was the son of a king. And his father, the king, loved him so much that he wanted to make sure that Siddhartha was as protected and cared for as it can possibly be done in the world. You see, when Siddhartha was still in his mother's belly, his father, the king, went and asked 7 different monks to prognosticate, to basically tell them what his son would be like. And 7 of them told him that his son could be an enlightened person, like a Buddha, a monk. And 6 of them also said that in addition to that, he could also be a great leader and king, right? So 6 of them said he could be either a great Buddha or he can be a great king, and only 1 of those 7 said he's going to be a great Buddha, right? He's going to renounce the world and live a monastic life. And as you can understand, that's really a great kind of like future telling. You know, either your son's going to be a great enlightened person or he's going to be a great king, which is probably the answer that you want to give a king when he asks you these things, right? Because you probably want to make sure that he doesn't chop your head off. But regardless, the predictions at the time were that Siddhartha was either going to be a great king or a great monk. And so what his father did was steal the game a little bit. He said, well, if I don't expose my son to any kind of religious implications and so forth, the natural consequence of this will be that he will become a great king. So he did exactly that. He provided for his son within his incredible palace. And so the legend goes that Siddhartha never left the palace until he was of age, until he was past his 20s, right? And that's because he really, really wanted to. Everything that he wanted, he had inside the palace. But eventually, one day, he asked his father so much that he wanted to go out that his father eventually agreed. And so the story goes that Siddhartha went with his friend, his childhood friend, who was also a serf, outside of the palace for a quick stroll so that his father could finally convince his son that he just really needs to stay in the palace and never bother him asking anymore. And something really incredible happened on this outing. This is the first time, as you can tell, that Siddhartha was out, and he took his chariot, and as we can see here in a picture and an illustration from a Laotian temple, which depicts this great story of what they call the foresight. During this quick chariot ride around and outside of the temple, Siddhartha was exposed to 4 different sights that gravely changed the way he looked at the world. And the first one, as you can imagine, was that he saw a person who was ill. And he had never seen that before. He had never seen anybody who was physically suffering in the palace because he had the best of everything. His parents spared no expense to protect him. So he asked his friend, what is that? What is that person, bent over like this and struggles to walk? And his friend, who was wise, says, that, my friend, is illness. You have never seen that before. And he was taken by it, and he continued on their journey, and he was meditating about it, so the story goes. A little while later, as they were also still going with their chariot, Siddhartha sees a second thing. He sees an old man, and he asks his friend, the charioteer, what is that? And the old man says, well, that is an old person. And Siddhartha then is taken by this idea that people actually get old and potentially die. He had never been exposed to that either. So that also stays with him, and that's the fourth sight. And the third sight that he sees, it's actually the body of somebody who is dead. And he asks him, what is that? And as you can tell, the story goes that his friend, the charioteer, who was guiding him, told him that is the body, that is the corpse of somebody who has passed. And Siddhartha, again, never being exposed to all of this, is taken by this different thing that only now in his adult age he's really seen. And so he thinks about it a little bit as they're going forward, and he also sees a monk meditating. And then he asks his friend, what is that? And his friend again says, that is a monk who's meditating around life and how to escape pain and be happy. And he has reclused himself from the world to tackle these problems. And hence the story goes, you have the four sights, right? So he sees an old person, he sees death, and he sees illnesses. And these are things that he has never been exposed to before. Basically, as you can tell, these are three ways of suffering that, regardless of our status, we will face in this life. We will all, at one point in time, experience illness or know somebody who experiences illness. We will all age and have to deal with that, and eventually all of us will also perish. Our physical body, at least, will die. And so that, on the way back to the temple, stuck with Siddhartha. But in addition to that, he also saw that monk. And that monk was about renunciation, was about escaping the world to try to achieve enlightenment and overcome all this other suffering. And all that stuck with him. And eventually, you know the rest of the story. What happens? He goes back to the temple, and so the story goes. Actually, quite funny. His father's expecting him in a big, big party because he wants to make sure that Siddhartha is happy to be back. And there are many dancers, and they're beautiful and they're young, and they dance for the king and for the prince. And the party goes on, and eventually Siddhartha falls asleep with the dancers. And he wakes up in the middle of the night with the beautiful dancers sleeping around him. And as you can tell, it was probably a quite wild party his dad threw for him. And he also looks at these beautiful dancers that were incredibly charming and beautiful at the dancing. As they're sleeping, he sees them with their hairs all bunched up, and they're maybe drooling a little bit. And he notices that they, too, from those beautiful things he had seen earlier on, they had also changed. They were not that which they first appeared. And so in the middle of the night, the story goes, he goes into reflection and meditation and decides that he will go out of the palace, renounce all of that, and take on the life of a monk, foregoing all the riches he had to, you know the rest of the story, find enlightenment and try to make sense of all the suffering, much to his father's chagrin. And so the Buddha eventually is born, or Buddha or the Great One, Siddhartha Gautama, from a sheltered prince who had no contact with the world and eventually finds enlightenment by reflecting on all these illnesses and all these great signs of suffering that he saw in his trip outside the palace, the so-called four sights in the Buddhist tradition. And why is it that I say that? Because it's quite emblematic, the story of the search for humanity's understanding of suffering. This is an old story. This is a story that is thousands of years in the making, this one in particular. But throughout our history as human beings, we have always struggled to understand why is it that we suffer? Why is it that we age? Why is it that we go through illnesses? Why is it that we die? Why is it that we hurt and ache? Why is it? And since we were young as a species, we've always been reflecting on why that is. But the interesting piece here, too, is Siddhartha took a very beautiful and psychological approach to all of this as he went in through his own personal search. And I think that his psychological approach, which I find fascinating, has a lot to do with what we find ourselves asking today. And I want to share a little bit more about that, about his great enlightenment. And so the story goes, under the tree, he eventually finds enlightenment when he realizes that there's this whole philosophy, there's a whole world. And eventually this beautiful set of precepts or beliefs, if you want to call them, comes out, and it's called the Four Noble Truths. And this is the core of the philosophy of the Buddha. And I find it highly applicable to us in a psychological perspective and a spiritual perspective. If you bear with me for a couple of extra minutes, I'll try to show you why. But I find it fascinating. Follow me along. So the first one here, if you can see the screen, is this assertion, this statement, that life is dukkha. And dukkha is a translation from the Sanskrit. And basically dukkha says that dukkha is struggle and suffering, right? So life is a constant struggle and constant suffering. So the Buddha says. That is the first precept, the first assumption from all of this. And then he tells us that this second precept, that the dukkha comes from clinging to impermanent things. And here where I think there's fantastic wisdom. So all our suffering and all our pain, he says, comes from us clinging on to things or states of mind or whatever you may call concept ideas that are impermanent in themselves. So if you attach yourself to something that will not last, this will likely cause you suffering. It is a very simple argument, but a really powerful and deep psychological outtake. And then the next one, you probably know, and he feels that if we can stop ourselves from attaching, craving, and clinging on to these impermanent things, if we can stop wanting to have these impermanent things that are going to go away and fade, then we will be happy. And the idea here is easy. If we are not attaching ourselves to things that will fade away and change and away, we will never be let down. So the fourth precept of all of this is a recipe of how to do this. He says that the way to liberation or to happiness or to nirvana is through what he prescribed as the Eightfold Path, the way of doing things. So 8 different things that you can do to get to a point where you will no longer want to attach yourself to impermanent things and therefore suffer. So far, so good? It's really a deep and really powerful but simple concept that Buddhism brings to us that's very, I think, pertinent to our modern lives because it touches everything we do. And according to the Buddhist tradition then, if we have the right view towards things, and we have the right resolve towards things, and we have the right speech towards things, and if we have the right action towards the world, if we have the right livelihood, the right job or way of earning your life, if we put the right effort forward, if we have the right mindfulness of things. And if we have the right concentration, we will be able to prevent ourselves from attaching ourselves to impermanent things. And therefore, we won't suffer. So, to me, a person that's not very smart, something that simple and that power really blows my spiritual socks off. Because here is a character, a personality, a person, historical figure, whatever you want to call that, thousands of years ago grappled with the same problems that we have today, which is pain and suffering, and has given us a recipe that is deep and timeless. And that recipe is, if we don't attach ourselves to things that are impermanent, we'll be happy. And so we ought to ask ourselves, what are these permanent and impermanent things? Right? And this is where I think the fantastic piece comes in. And I find that it has a great overlap with Spiritism in general, because if you look back into this tiny little book called What is Spiritism that Allan Kardec wrote, one of the definitions he gives of Spiritism is a science which deals with the nature, origin, and destiny of spirits, as well as their relation to the corporeal world. So I find it fascinating because I see a clear connection here, because in Spiritism, we strive to understand who we are, the nature of spirits, where do we come from, and where we're going. But we also strive to understand what kind of relationship our spirit has to this physical world that we live in. And I want to claim that this physical world here is that impermanent state that Siddhartha, or the Buddha, was talking about thousands of years ago. So if we were to bridge these two things together, I would say, we're using newer words, that, and with a Spiritist perspective, that if we continue to focus ourselves and center our lives around the idea that the physical life is all there is, then we will find great suffer, great pain. We will suffer greatly because the things that are physical, they are impermanent. Our bodies fade and eventually decay. Cars break down. Houses are sold and bought and lost. Everything that's physical will not last. So for as long as we focus on our reality being exclusively material, there is no way we're going to be happy. And maybe that's why we also see great accordance with the gospel of Jesus when we see things like Matthew 6:20, which says, gather your treasures not on earth, where rust spoils it and moths spoil it, or that where thieves steal it. Instead, gather your treasures in heaven, right? So that is to say, put all your attention, everything that you care for, in the spiritual first. And if you do that, then you won't rust, you won't be spoiled, and you won't be stolen by somebody else, and therefore you will not suffer. So I feel like there is a really great overlap between the Buddhist teachings of more than 2,000 years ago with the Christ teachings 2,000 years ago to what we are trying to understand today with Spiritism, which we see as a natural continuation or rebirth and rediscovery of the Christ teachings through contact with the spiritual world. So in that sense, I feel like Spiritism is really greatly equipped to help us understand how we can avoid suffering. Because if we pay attention to the spiritual world, if we expand our idea beyond the physical world, then that pain that seems so unsurmountable now that we talked about won't be as painful as we think it is. And we will also know that it will only last a short amount of time. And we will know that God exists and is great and will be able to help us through these situations. And that, in fact, eventually, we are going to be happy. We are going to have the opportunity to reincarnate and work on different problems and solve them in the long term. But you might ask me, then, why do you say that with so much certainty? Well, I say that with so much certainty, not because the Buddha told me or I read it about the Christ. That also makes sense for me logically. But I also have the benefit of knowing that the great messengers of above still come down and tell us through mediumship that that is the case. So it's not just a story from thousands of years ago or two stories from thousands of years ago that reassure me. It's also the certainty that there is a spiritual world, there is a world beyond the one we live in, because as Spiritists, we have had the chance to study and practice mediumship. And in our mediumship studies and mediumistic practice, we have been able to engage with the souls of those who have lived before us that come back to tell us that that is the case, that life goes on, and that the suffering that they experienced on earth were really small compared to the joys of what they experienced in the great beyond. And if you don't have to trust me for that, you definitely don't need to. But you can go out and read for yourself. See, there's a vast body of knowledge there, a vast number of books and things that will show you how mediumship has given us great knowledge about the existence of life after this one. So there are many studies out there that you can read and look if you want to. And in Spiritism ourselves, there's many books that we can resort to that talk about this interaction between both sides of life. And the fact that there is this interaction between both sides of life means that life goes on. And so suicide is not the end. So when we have this idea that there is, in fact, a spiritual world that predates and lives after our physical world, then we will find out that a suicide attempt or a suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem, that we might choose to end our lives physically and still have to deal with the same feelings and same problems on the other side of life. And that, in fact, we might find ourselves worse off on the other side of life when we realize that, because then we might feel some guilt that we have taken our own lives and missed the opportunity to work some of those challenges out while we were still on earth, and now we may have to come back and address them again. And many times our good spirits tell us that they really are touched and are deeply, deeply, deeply touched. That many souls who have gone to suicide come tell them that they are sad because they have missed that experience, and they will have to come back and redo these difficult trials. And in fact, in our own Spiritist literature, we find many tales of that. There are wonderful books that tell us stories of folks who have gone through this. One of them that comes to life is a very hard and really thick book called Memoirs of a Suicide. Another one that's always interesting for us to read as well is called Heaven and Hell by Allan Kardec. And the second part of Heaven and Hell, I think, is really great. It's about testimonies. The spirits come back and give us testimonies of how the life was when they were in the physical body, when they were incarnate, and how they find themselves in the spiritual world now they have passed on, which is great because we find stories of people who behaved well and are really happy about the choices they've made, and there are stories of those who didn't make great choices and now regret how they feel. So to round it all up and be mindful over time as well, my point here is simple, is that Spiritism, which is the study of the origin, destiny, and nature of spirits and their relationship to the physical world, is helping us understand that there is life beyond the physical body. And if that is the case, then escaping suffering here is just a temporary thing, that we will have to face suffering or the causes for that suffering in the afterlife too. And if we can then start teaching ourselves the understanding that life goes on, it may help us bear the burden of the challenges that have come forward and led us to believe that we have such a big problem that they're unsurmountable. We will better understand that there is hope and there is treatment for depression. We will better understand the causes and consequences of psychotic or schizophrenic development and that there also may be spiritual influences at play that can be worked on. But we'll also understand that it's important for us to try to live a life of moderation and not be as impulsive, because the actions that we take today affect our consequences of tomorrow and the life after. And that we can and should help others to make sure that they understand that. And that, in fact, the whole philosophical desire of ending our life now because we're in terminal illness may shift a little bit when we understand the reasons why we are undergoing these challenges and the sufferings here. Kardec also wisely tells us that every cause has, every effect has a cause, right? So every consequence has a cause. These are things of the physical world we know. If something happened, it's because something caused it. And he also helps us to understand that sometimes if we cannot find the causes for the suffering that we face now in this life, these causes must necessarily come from before. Otherwise, it will be an unfair world. It would make no sense. If we can't find a cause for an effect, then we have a problem. And so when we struggle with the suffering and pain and everything else, this knowledge can help us make sense of things a little bit and understand that as spiritual beings, our life is multifold. It is multiple incarnations, multiple lives tied together. And then what we do in one spills over to the next and the next. So if we don't find the cause for our suffering in this one, it's necessarily connected to the previous one, and we still need to learn a lesson, whichever it may be, that teaches us to detach from the impermanent things and focus more on the permanent things, right? And to wrap it up then, we think that, at least I think that the story of Lazarus in the New Testament is very symbolic of all of this. If you remember back in the Gospel of John, there's this beautiful story of Lazarus who has apparently died, and Martha, his sister, comes and asks Jesus to go back because she believes that this great teacher, this great soul, can resurrect Lazarus, can bring Lazarus back to life. And they go out to Jesus, and they live a little bit far away, and Jesus actually says, I won't go now, but I'll go in a couple of days. And that is surprising, right? Because why would you not go now and help now? Why wait a couple of days? Because he was so certain that he would be okay to help, and that was a teachable moment, that he actually waited a couple of days, so there was no doubt that Lazarus has indeed passed. And he went back there and eventually resurrected Lazarus. But the dialogue between Martha and Jesus is a beautiful one because it's symbolic of the spiritual transformation that I feel we undergo. Martha asked, you know, please, would you come and help Lazarus? And then Jesus says, do you believe that I can help? Do you believe in the spiritual life? Do you believe in all that? And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day, right? I know that he will rise again eventually. And Jesus then tells to her, I am the resurrection and the life. That is, the teachings that I bring forth, that of spirituality, of life after life, are the resurrection, and it's one true life. The one who believes in me will live. So if you believe in these teachings, that life goes on and there's a spiritual world, you will live even though you die, because there will be no death. There will be only transformation, right? And he goes on, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And he reaffirms that. If you live your life believing in the spiritual and focusing on the spiritual sense of things, you will never experience death, because there is no death. And then he asks, do you believe this? And she goes on to say so. So the invitation that is there is for us to consider ourselves as Lazarus, as walking Lazarus today in this world, where we are alive, but we are dead to the spiritual world, in the sense that we do not pay any attention to the spiritual world. Isn't that curious? That we go about our lives, even if we know about spirituality, and don't think about it. So the invitation here is for us to reaffirm our belief in something spiritual and understand that we are spirits first and physical body second. That the fact that we are in a physical body is because we need this experience to evolve and learn, but that our true selves are spiritual in nature. So it makes no sense for us to pin all our hopes, our aspirations in a physical reality, in the physical life that we all live in, that we will not last, because we know that our bodies will age, we will get ill, and we will pass. So why are we hanging our hat on that hook? Why are we not focusing on spirituality as a whole? When we do, we hope that suffering in general will be greatly reduced. There might still be pain and, of course, tough challenges because we need to correct our thinking and our process, but suffering will be made more bearable, right? And that's why maybe we see in Matthew 11 when Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, all that you're suffering and tired, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Take my learnings, take my teachings, and put it on you. Try it for size, right? And learn from me that I have gone through all this, and I have trained myself to be gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls because you will be transformed by the spiritual knowledge." And what we hope to say here then at the end is that suicide really is not the end, because there is no end. There is no end to life. Life goes on. But the challenge is that we as a society have not yet figured that out. So we still think that everything that we see around us is physical in nature. And when we are prepared to open ourselves to the spiritual sense in us, these sufferings are greatly reduced. And my big hope is that we will no longer consider suicide a viable option, because it's a very, very, very permanent solution for a problem that only lasts a second in the great aspects of things. While it's happening, it hurts. So if we can raise our heads from the pain and see ourselves as spiritual beings, my hope is that we will change the way we look at life, and life will change for us. And then suicide will definitely not be the answer, and it will definitely not be the end. And it will make it easier for us to bear our own cross and evolve and grow. And so one way to do that is continue the conversation, read more about the topic, remind ourselves of spirituality, go to your spiritist group and talk to folks, read good books, think for yourselves, practice reminding yourself every day in the mirror that you're a spirit and that everything will pass and this is just a physical world. Whatever works for you. But take 5 minutes of your day, just ponder about this. Make an experiment with yourself and see if your life doesn't change, even a very tiny bit. I suspect that it will change greatly because I know it's changed mine. So thank you for your time. I hope that you continue to engage in thought about pain, suffering, and suicide, and find ways of lifting yourself above from the material world to think of yourself as a spirit first, and everything will fall into place. And with that, I stop really quickly, and I will turn over to our great moderator to see if you have questions or comments that we might want to address, and then I'll stop at it.
Thank you, Danielle. That was a great lecture. So much wonderful information shared. When you said, when you described kind of those 6 main reasons why people commit suicide, and mostly living here in the Bay Area, which is a very material-centric type of society, really, that we see people with, you know, good jobs, beautiful cars, nice homes. Nevertheless, a lot of people depressed, having to take medicine, that feel alone in the middle of everyone. I guess I have a question for you. That you said that suicide is not, it's not a solution, mostly because we are eternal spirits, right? Nevertheless, if I don't believe in God, and then I am so desperate, and I'm suffering so much, and even though I have these things that, you know, people may think that how lucky I am, I still feel like I don't have anything. And I want to believe in God. I want to have faith that something can get better. But still, I continue kind of locked in this vicious cycle of desperation and loneliness and unhappiness. Do you have any recommendation? You mentioned the gospel. You mentioned kind of the numbers that people can call do you have other enlightenment? Because when you're in the kind of that dark side and rock bottom, it's very hard to get out.
Oh, it's extremely hard to get out, right? And if I were more time, I will tell you about other kinds of research that I find very, very interesting. For instance, there is a researcher, Barbara Eric Fredrickson is her name, and she does some studies on the emotional piece of things. And basically, her research, the way I understand it, proves that the further, Barbara Fredrickson is her name, the further down you go into a negative state of mind, the harder it is for you to see different options. So it's kind of like a wooden downward spiral, right? The further you go into depression and to sadness, it's difficult for you to see the way out. And obviously, one great idea is to know yourself, and when you catch yourself going that before it gets uglier, to try to pull yourself up. Obviously, that's easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
The other piece is, you know, to have people around you or know a support system that you can rely on to, and do not be ashamed of asking for help. All of us need help at one point in time. I mean, if you think about it, we all have been or experienced depression to a certain state. Obviously, some of us struggle with a lot more than others, even for genetic reasons, right? But these are serious things. These are not just like, you know, temporary challenges that we face. These are real big problems, and we all feel that way. The challenge emotionally, I feel, is pulling yourself outside of a box, right? We have that expression of like thinking outside of the box, and I think that's really great for this here as well, because if you imagine the box to be our own world and our own experiences, when we are only thinking inside of our own world and our own experiences, I can understand how it gets ugly and hairy really quick, because we just think about our lives, we just think about the things we know, and we can go into a downward spiral because we don't see the way out. But if we're able to think outside the box, that is, pull ourselves from our own existence and try to consider something greater or somebody else's existence, that might help a little bit in terms of the feeling and the pain. Maybe if we go out and for a second try not to focus on our pain but focus on somebody else's, we will get a little breathing room. In fact, there are a lot of doctors who are now doing this therapy of people with depression to actually go out and volunteer in soup kitchens or whatever it is, to get outside of their pain and focus on something else. And then they all of a sudden will find out that their pain is not as deep as they thought it was, therefore allowing them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and focus more positively in the world, right? To kind of take themselves out. But going back to the question of God, I think that's the key point for me, the way I look at it. If you don't believe in God, if you don't believe in something spiritual, I can understand how you can get trapped in a maze of suffering and pain. Because if you don't believe in anything else other than the physical world, then you can argue for yourself that you should do whatever it is that you can right now to feel pleasure and gain, because there will be no consequences. If you step on other people, if you rob them, if you kill them, who cares, right? It's only about here and now. One of my least favorite sentences is that whole movement that came about. I don't know if you guys remember YOLO, you only live once. That sometimes is pretty horrible, because it gives people almost like a permission to do whatever it is that they want to do, and at the expense of other people, right? And that, I think, is a dangerous piece. So how do we get out of there? By trying to search God or trying to search spirituality. And sometimes people have trouble with the word God. Sometimes people have trouble with the word religion. And I understand that, because we all have different experiences and we were raised different. And however that word came across might have caused us to, you know, because of somebody else's action, not to like them. But my point is, go look for yourself and see if there are things that can convince you of this. Know yourself a little bit. If you are an emotional person, and by that I mean if your feelings drive you and you are really taken by them, then do something uplifting. Listen to, you know, an orchestra or jazz, or go see a play, something that touches your heart so that you can kind of lift yourself up. If you're a logical person, start asking questions and go down the path of science if you want to, and start going down and saying, for instance, if every effect has a cause, then what caused this? What caused this? as you remount back into the existence of science and reality, we are going to go back to an old philosophical conundrum that the Greeks explored, which Aristotle called the first unmoved mover. And everything goes back to a cause, right? If I push a Trader Joe's cart down the street after I went grocery shopping, the reason why the cart's moving is because I pushed it, right? So if you see the cart moving and you look back in time, you'll be able to see me, right? And then maybe I pushed back because somebody else pushed me. So you can go back in the pieces. But eventually you're going to get to a point, to the beginning of the universe or whatever it is, that had no beginning. And that is a logical conundrum. So somebody must have started that. That's what we call God. So logically you can make the case for God this way. And logically you can look at different things like and I can go off on this, and I love this stuff. Like, I don't know if you guys think about this, but like the fact that gravity, the law of gravity is the same everywhere, or that statistically speaking, you can toss a coin up. If the coin is exactly the same, there's always a 50-50 chance that you will land on one side or the other. That's like the universe telling you that there's order and there's justice. And I think that blows my mind, right? Because there is an underlying order to things even when we think there's chaos. And if there is order, then these laws have to be conceived by something that put them in motion. And if these laws are just, the motion, whoever put this in motion must also be just. So it's about, for me, and I'll shut up because I know I talk too much, but for me it's about finding an into finding out for yourself. Like, what is it that appeals to you? If logic and reason appeals to you, then go into science and find out all these things that are like, what are the chances of this happening by random, right? And we're going to find out that more and more there are many different ways of arriving at the same understanding of God, right? Whether it be through inspiration or through emotions or music or science or poetry. I'm a big poetry guy myself. When I read poetry, I'm deeply touched. And it touches the innermost fibers of my being, and it's almost a spiritual thing, right? So there's these things that can lead us to there, but the truth is, at the end of the day, like everything else, nobody can convince us of anything. We need to convince ourselves. We need to do this paradigm shift where we have to open ourselves to new information, take it in, digest it, and decide whether we want to take that in and accept that or not. So the most basic of things today for us are still difficult for others, right? There are folks who still believe, for instance, that we have never been to the moon, right? There are folks today who still believe that medicine's not a good thing, right? So people see things differently, and that's okay because it's their perspective. But for us to change our mind, we need to open ourselves to the evidence that's out there, and I say the evidence abounds. So I would urge you to ask yourselves, what is it that I would need to be sure that God exists? Mm-hmm. And then once you have that goalpost, because I don't know about you guys, but I have friends who have seen incredible things, incredible spiritual phenomena, whatever it is, and they're never satisfied, right? And at one point I was talking to this great friend of mine, and I asked her, like, okay, you've seen this, you have the spirit messages, you had these crazy things happen that give you lots of things that could not have happened, randomly. Like, what is it that you want that would prove for you that God and spirituality exists, right? And she couldn't answer that, and she was taken by that, right? Because whatever came her way, she always pushed it back as not enough, as not enough. But you have to find out what is it enough for you, what is it that will ultimately help you make sense of that world, and then go for it. And that's the challenge that everybody has to kind of undergo by themselves, right?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that the person having the willingness to find out, so what do I need to know? What answers would convince me that God exists? And look for them. Because many times we kind of forget in this very comfortable situation saying, I want to be convinced, but as you said, this faith is not something that comes from outside in, it's something that comes from inside out. So yeah. if I don't look for it, if I don't kind of assess what is important for me to believe, and for example, for you, maybe something that is different than for me, and for other people, each one of us need different things. But if we do not understand that, as in any other thing in life, right, if I don't know what I need from my own health, if I don't understand what I need to be happy with my job, what do I need to be happy with my marriage, what do I need, I would never be happy, right? So I will always kind of looking at the problems instead of looking for the solutions. And that's a very easy trap that we see 80% of the population always being very good in pointing problems, but very few looking at how to solve those problems, right?
Gandhi has a great, if I may say so, Gandhi, that's why I really am a big Gandhi fan, right? I think it's fantastic. What a great spirit. And he has this sentence this quote that always touched me, as he said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
That's why it's important to also not only know, but talk to people around you, right? And here's when we're talking about the importance of family and friends. I don't know about you guys, but I know that learning is a team sport, and you really learn by exchanging ideas because it helps you, again, think outside your box, right? If you're always by yourself, it's going to be a lot harder for you to be exposed to different perceptions and therefore have something that you can think about differently, right? And so it's always great for you to find people who you think care for yourself and are interested in these things too, and so you can exchange ideas and grow, right? And ask advice and ask people, bounce ideas off of them. You know, hey, what do you think about this? And be open to it because it's the only way we learn. And if we don't learn by conversations like this, you know, life will teach us and force us to change our own minds. Right?
I just want to ask you a last question before we go to our final prayer, which is, of course, there are people who kind of consciously or unconsciously go to the route of the suicide, intentionally or not intentionally, as you said, for example, with the medication or kind of just, you know, doing something more dramatic. But there is also this indirect suicide. So I don't kill myself, but I become like a dead body, right? So I drink a lot to forget my problems, or I work a lot, or I travel all the time, or I buy stuff nonstop. So somehow I am not being present, and I'm not, how do I say that? In the Gospel according to the Spiritist, there's a good sentence that they use, which is, it's kind of, we live by instead of living our life, right? So, can you comment about that? Because I think that that's another thing that we see a lot nowadays, that people kind of get lost in those, would say, impermanent things, as you said, the temporary things, instead of focusing on the real problem.
Yeah, and I think that's everybody's challenge, right? I think that myself included. I think that the challenge of our times is that we have grown in comfort and in understanding of science and so forth, and we have created this false sense of security because we want to believe in these things that are right in front of us, right? But the truth is that not everything is in front of us. Not everything can be seen by the eye, and I think if you think about it, science has proven that. Like we have electricity, we have air, we have gravity, and these are all invisible things, right? That nevertheless, nevertheless are there. So we need to shift that a little bit. And I'm reminded, I'm constantly thinking about this because this is a topic that I think myself about very often. And I am reminded of another impactful, I'm very quotey today. And an impactful verse from the New Testament from Paul's epistles to the Ephesians. And the sentence goes, like, you know, awaken you who sleep, rise from the dead, and the Christ will enlighten you, right? So it's an interesting play on words because I think it speaks to what you were talking about. It's like, awaken you who sleep, rise from the dead, and the Christ will enlighten you. Like, so how can you awaken from being dead, right? And I think the whole point is exactly that. We go through our lives sometimes, and when we go through our physical lives without thinking about spirituality, we're basically dead. We are really just going through the motions, and we have not really learned the lesson. And unless we think about spirituality and get enlightened, right, that's what I mean by the Christ will enlighten you. The teachings of spirituality and life after life will awaken you to a whole different perspective of life. We are going to be condemned to relive that life, right? Like keep going through it until we get it. So we're very fortunate, too, that nowadays in our modern society, they gave us all that technology and so forth. It's easy for us to find information. The challenge is finding information that we really want to pay attention to. But there's lots of information out there, like Spiritism, for instance, that points to the fact that we are more than a physical body. So unless we lift that veil and peek at the fact that we are spiritual beings too, we are really going to struggle with not being just dead but alive, right? Like, it's almost like the zombies, right? Like, you're alive but you're dead, right? You keep walking around but you're not, like the TV shows, like Walking Dead and everything else. It's a big spiritual metaphor, right? Like, there's all these people there that really won't die even though they're dead, but they're not living. And that's kind of us today in our society. We're the threshold of that piece, but it's an individual sport on that when it comes to that. Enlightenment is individual, right? So I would urge people to just think about it, just consider it. And we're not asking folks to do something monumental. We're not asking them to spend their life like the Buddha, right, outside the palace and meditating about things. We're saying is, take some time to reflect, 5 minutes a day. Do we take 5 minutes of our day to think of ourselves every day as a spiritual being, right? Elevate your feelings. Think about something greater. Pursue something that will really make you think about why you're here. What are your goals for life? What do you want? Are you being a good person? Do you want to change the way you are? What will make you happy? We're not asking ourselves those questions. We're letting the world dictate to us where is it the world wants us to go. And as long as that happens, we're going to be fed. So if we don't take the reins of our own destiny and try to search for our own happiness, the world will push us down a road where we will suffer until we are forced to think for ourselves and find the reasons why, right? So our big hope is that we can be proactive and just do some small reflections every day. The way I do that is I pray every night before going to sleep, and I take 5 minutes to reflect on my day, as St. Augustine suggested. And we see that suggestion, for instance, in the Spirit's book, which is a fantastic book. And I try to think about, okay, what are the things that I could do different, and next day I try to do it different. And I found that has bring me a lot of joy and a lot of happiness, and has, if not taken all my pain away, because I'm human and I'm not always happy all the time, and I know there's challenge, but I do know this. I know that I see problems now in a much different way, and while they still bother me, I know that they're just temporary because of my spiritual certainty, my spiritual beliefs, right? So if anybody, if for no other reason other than being selfish, which is funny enough, like how can you be selfish and spiritual at the same time? Because being spiritual, it's a selfish thing, right? If you want to suffer less and be selfish by saying, I don't want to suffer as much, then get going on a spirituality piece. It benefits you to believe in something spiritual because it's going to ease your pain. It's kind of funny how selfishness can kind of work for you in a way, So hopefully folks will take some time to think about their spiritual self and consider themselves that they don't want to be those zombies. I don't know if you've done this, and I'll shut up, but sometimes I'm like, somebody else is driving the car, I'm on the freeway, or I'm thinking about, I look outside the window, I see all these cars and all these people going different places with all their different lives, and I'm taken by a sense of awe. I'm like, wow, look at that. So many people that I don't know, I never met. I wonder what they're doing. Are they going to their wives, their husbands, their kids, their work? And it's just huge and big. And then it comes to me every once in a while, how many of us, how many of those know that they are spirits? And all that they're going through is just a temporary experience, right? And then I try to remind you when I do those same things, when I pick up my kid, at the preschool or so forth and so forth. So hopefully we can address the root cause, which is let's be more spiritual people. The rest will fall into place. Right?
Thank you, Danielle. I really appreciate. It was a great lecture to make us think not only about where we are, but also where do we want to go. So right now we're going to go to our final prayer, and we're going to ask Katie to do the final prayer for us.
Yeah, and Anna, before we do a final prayer, can I do a shameless plug? I was going to just ask people if they want to get in touch, I'm trying to do the Twitter thing. Tweet at me at @OneSpiritist or visit my little blog called Unshakable-Faith. Engage in a conversation. We're trying to do podcasts too of talking about these things. I feel like it's really great to continue the conversation and obviously invite folks to want to talk more about these things too, to go to the Spiritist groups and see if that's something that you want to do. You know, continue the conversation with other folks in other places.
Thank you.
Sorry for that. Thanks for the plug.
No. So it's the Unshakable Faith. Can you say
Unshakable-faith.org or the number 1 and then Spiritist for Twitter.
That's, let me, I'm gonna, do you have the link at your presentation so we could?
I do.
Yeah,
I do.
You want to pull it up? Because I
yes.
think it will be a good idea.
And we're trying this podcast thing now too, where we're trying to talk to people about things. And one of the things, for instance, that we talked about in Canada, there is assistance in dying. There is a, can you see my screen by any chance?
Not yet.
Okay, hold on a sec. And we did this thing where we're asking our Canadian friends too at the Spirit Society of Toronto about this law that passed in Canada, and now that people can also ask and choose to get assistance in ending their own lives, right? So there's all these different topics that are hard for us to understand if we don't have a spiritual perspective. And so what you see there in the screen, I hope you can see it's my name, Twitter, the blog, and obviously my email as well. Feel free to reach out to me. I love talking to folks. I am a little bit slow on email, but everything else should work.
Thank you, Danielle. If there is one thing that you're not, is slow. So we appreciate it. Was a great evening. What a way to study together. Thank you very much, Danielle.
Thank you.
So, Katie, if you want to lead us to the final prayer, please.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Let us all close our eyes. Let us concentrate our thoughts all together. Let's send our love and our care and our consolation to all those who have committed suicide, all those who are thinking about it, all those family members and friends who are affected by it. Let's send this love, and let's all imagine that we are holding each other's hands in one giant circle here in California, here in the U.S., all around the world. May we all be holding our hands. Feel the warmth of our hands, feel the love in these hands as we send this love and this consolation to all those who are affected by this. May we imagine Jesus dropping seeds of love and care and strength upon all of our heads. We feel this light coming to us, and may we feel this hope, and may we, as we hold hands, may we pass this hope from one hand to another, that we all feel like we're not alone, we all feel like we have each other, we all go through difficult times, may we all know that we can count on each other, we're all one big family as brothers and sisters, and may we remember that following the light, following the path of Jesus, and we will all be okay. Amen.
Thank you. That was a beautiful prayer. Thank you. I love the idea of holding hands, and
yes.
And we are together on this. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight. And our next virtual lecture is going to be in October with our dear friend Daniel Santos, and he will be talking about one of the books of André Luiz, Sex and Destiny. So see you then. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you, guys. Bye.